When I came to BYU a little over 30 years ago and was teaching in the Italian department, I was interested in graduate work that I had been doing on the Italian-American immigration experience. And I was interested in what was going on, or what had gone on in Utah with Italian immigration. And as I looked through the literature, I kept running into this obvious Italian name, and it surprised me in the state of Utah because I didn't think much had gone on here. But here was Mr. Phillip Notarianni from Calabria, Italy, who had done an amazing amount of work with ethnic groups and Italians, particularly in Carbon County and other parts of the state of Utah. So now 20 or 30 years later, Phil, you're here. We're still friends, and we're very happy to have you talk to us. Dr. Notarianni teaches at the University of Utah in addition to his work with the Utah State Historical Society. He has a long list of publications dealing with Italians in Utah, with Asian Americans in Utah, family publications in Preface, Italian Community, and Missing Stories, and Oral History of Ethnic and Minority Groups in Utah, and also work on Places of Origin, Calabrese, and Carbon County, Utah. He holds a master's degree and a PhD from the University of Utah and teaches the Peoples of Utah class at the University of Utah. He's a great friend. He's an internationalist of the first order. He has taken his international experience and applied it directly to the state of Utah and the work and the communities that we live within. And it's a great privilege to have Dr. Notarianni with us. Please welcome him, and when he finishes his presentation, he'll have time for questions. So as questions come to your mind, jot them down, and we'll have a rewarding experience being with him today. Dr. Notarianni.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I'm not used to these kind of mics to wire up here. Well, it's indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be here. As Rod was so gracious in his introduction, I am of Italian-American background, and I learned very early in my career that to be a historian, you had to try and be a jack of all trades. And so in the course of my preparation over the years, I found that really the interdisciplinary studies of history was something very, very important and vital. And as I unraveled my own career to where I started looking at my own history and tried to make a connection, I found that it was very important to understand that in Utah's history is a history that's not just significant to us. It's not just significant in the regional sense, that is the Western United States sense. It's not just important in the national context, but indeed important in the international context. The one thing that before I begin the formal presentation, the one incident that brought that to my mind most vividly, I was fortunate enough in 1987 and 1888, or 1987 and 1988, to have a Fulbright research grant to go to Italy. Now, my parents were born and raised in southern Italy. It's the tip of the toe. It's the region called Calabria. And I was born here in the United States, as were my two sisters and my brother. So I went to Calabria that year to look at the places of origin of Italians who had come to Utah. That time I had studied Carbon County. I had studied many of the other areas in the state that attracted Italians. And there were 5 basic towns in this region of southern Italy that fed a lot of the immigrants that came to Utah. And I wanted to find out about them. I wanted to see what kind of connections existed. Had no preconceived notions of anything, really. I didn't try to communicate with people from that town or anything. I wanted to go in totally unannounced and find out what I could find out. So my wife and I, and my wife was born and raised in Italy. She came to this country when she was 19 years old, and we met in Trenton, New Jersey. But that's a story that I can't get into. It's too long. Anyway, so we're driving into one of these little towns. It's about 10:30 in the morning. And I see a group of older men and women gathered, conversing. Italians love to talk, and they love to do it in kind of a central place in the towns. So I drove up, and I parked the car, and I got out, and I walked up, and I said, "Buongiorno, mi chiamo Notarianni Filippo. Good morning, my name is Phillip Notarianni. Sono degli Stati Uniti. I'm from the United States." This lady looked at me, and she said to me, "Have you ever heard of Helper, Utah?" And I just went, oh my gosh. I told my wife, I said, people in Utah don't know where Helper is. And here this lady is 7,000 miles away, and she's asking me if I ever heard. The significance of that to me was that this woman's point of reference to the United States wasn't New York, New York, wasn't Chicago, Illinois, or San Francisco, California. It was Helper, Utah, a little town in Carbon County, about 120 miles south of Salt Lake City. And this woman, that was her point of reference. And I told myself at that point, I says, you know what, there's something to this. And what I unraveled to that, or what I unraveled from that, was that our history in Utah is part of that history in Italy, and their history is part of our history. And that really connects the international components, I think, to what I'd like to do. This presentation is a little more lengthier than I have time to do real justice to it. In fact, I usually do it during a whole semester. But what I'd like to do now is to show some slides, because I think it's important for you to understand the diversity in the state of Utah from way back and how it continues, and that it's a vitality, it's a vibrancy. And if there's one message that I try to impart upon students from this, and it's something that's been related to me by Reverend Francis Davis, who is the pastor of the Calvary Baptist Church in Salt Lake City, is that diversity does not mean more than nor less than. It just means different than. And if we can understand values, understand cultures, understand where we come from and where the people from the various cultural backgrounds come from, and try to understand that, then I think we'll begin to communicate openly, and communication, I think, is the key to a better understanding. So we can have the lights. What I like to do when I point out, and I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly, but we'll leave some time for some comments. When we look at Utah, at diversity in the state of Utah, we have to look at the beginnings. We have to look at the prehistoric cultures that archaeologists tell us were in Utah around 10,000 years ago. This is what is called the Poncho House in San Juan County. It's a Pueblo-style dwelling. For archaeologists studying prehistory and prehistoric cultures, the site itself is the document. We historians have journals and diaries and letters. Archaeologists don't. What they have are the sites. That's why it's very important to maintain the integrity of those sites, so that the items collected there, the projectile points, the pottery sherds, all of those materials are the sources, are the resources for archaeologists to help them understand that in Utah we have cultures that were here long before European settlement. And when we look at structures like this and the artifacts that come from them, it gives us a clear picture that these civilizations, that these cultures were vibrant, were active, were involved in trade. So even at that time, we're finding items of trade whose origins were not in Utah area, but perhaps in California. So we understand that there was trade and there was action going on even in that time. We have the rock art, the pictographs that are painted, the petroglyphs that are pecked, that tell us about these cultures, that help us understand the visuals, help us understand the relationship of individuals, help us understand the importance of the nomadic or the hunting style that these cultures had. Around 1300 AD, archaeologists studying the Utah area found that there were some changes occurring. And these people, these early cultures, were put in motion. We call them the Anasazi and the Fremont. That's just contemporary names to these cultures. But they were put in motion. And they moved, or they left, or they combined. We're not really sure. But around 1300 then, we begin to see some of the newer groups, or the groups that we're most familiar with, that have come in the state. The Ute Indians, and this gentleman in the middle is Chief Ouray. And I find it very important for you to see historic photographs, to understand the importance of these photographs for not only the fact that they appear here, but what they tell us. Chief Ouray and the Ute Indians, the Utes, settled, of course, up in the northeastern part of the state of Utah. And they were very much related to the Plains Indians, and became very significant and continue to be in the history of the state. After all, we are the state of Utah. We have the Paiutes. The Paiutes were located down in the central part of the state. We think they're related to some of the groups up from Southern California. These groups, it's very significant when you look at the housing. These particular types of housing are called wickiups. And again, sort of imbue the fact that these people interacted with the land in a very positive way, but the land had no ownership. The land was there to be used. That's a value. That's a value. And that value would come into conflict with other groups that would come into Utah later. The northwest band of the Shoshone in the extreme northwestern part of the state, coming down, also Plains Indians, and you can see from this early photograph the teepee, the young woman carrying the brush, the teepee both as a permanent type housing, but also one that could be taken down and moved as these people, again, interacted with the land. The Goshute Indians on the extreme western border of the states of the western border between Utah and Nevada. Here is a young woman with a child. We're all people. We all have same interests. We're all involved in trying to survive. The Goshutes lived in a very, very, very harsh area. Still do. Still do. There's not very many of them. Yet they survive, and really they flourished in this area. I had at one time, someone came to my class to speak about this, and these Indians, even in 1861, when Mark Twain came through and later wrote the book Roughing It, called these Indians Digger Indians, and insinuated that they were really crude and not educated, but they could survive off of 88 different species of vegetation. I mean, it takes a lot to survive in that situation. So again, kind of putting our values of what is an educated person onto a group like this where they have been able to survive. The Navajo Indians. We believe the Navajos came from up north, from the Canadian area. They settled also into the Four Corners region, and really have become very successful because, like the Utes to a large degree, were able to adapt and to change. They've taken items that really were not part of their culture, that were part of another culture, like the silversmithing from the Spanish or the rug making, took it and made it theirs and adapted it. And so it's become very important. So these groups were really the groups that were here when we first had European contact. They were the groups that really paved a lot of the roads that today are our freeways and highways and so on and so forth. They traded with each other and they interacted with each other. In the 1760s then, for Utah, as early as 1763, we began to see Spanish exploration into this region. And perhaps the most well-known expedition is that of July of 1776, known as the Dominguez Escalante expedition. Dominguez Escalante were trying to find a route from Santa Fe, New Mexico, around the Grand Canyon into the southern missions that they had established in California. And they were trying to find that route. And the Ute Indians who had come into contact with the Spanish first and had acquired the horse, which is another main significant aspect of Ute culture, they were the ones that helped guide these two Franciscan Catholic priests into Utah, and it occurred just about the same time that the Declaration of Independence was being signed in Philadelphia. Well, these two priests, along with their entourage, which included a cartographer named Miera, mapped and kept a diary of their experience in Utah, going up along the Canadian or the Colorado border, then into Utah around Vernal area, down through the central part, down to what we now know as Spanish Fork Canyon. And as you go up the canyon now, you'll see that cross that's up on the hill. That's called Dominguez Hill. We think that's the spot where Escalante, in his diary, wrote that he looked down on Utah Lake and he saw the Ute Indians, and he saw irrigation ditches. So these people were using irrigation methods. Even some of the Anasazi people down in San Juan County, we can see where they had used irrigation. But Escalante described all of this situation. They went down through that part, down through Provo, over to Milford, down to Cedar City, and in about October of 1776 realized that winter was coming on. They cast lots to see if they would try to continue to California or go back to Santa Fe. It came up that they should return to Santa Fe, so they went back to Santa Fe. But that expedition really kind of set the stage later on for wanting a deeper understanding of this particular region. Now, to show you and to try to connect how international events even then continued to play an important role in our history, and I'll be very brief, but these were Franciscan Catholic priests. There were also Jesuit Catholic priests who were very much involved in exploration. And if things would have remained the same, these priests would have come back with a full military component and would have established formal missions in Utah. But because of international affairs going on with the Pope and the Bourbon kings, the Jesuits were expelled from the New World, and there was really no other Catholic groups that could pick up their slack except for the Franciscans. So they were not allowed to come back to Utah. And so had they come back, who knows, our history would have been probably significantly different. Well, in the things kind of went and stayed that way. The Spanish didn't come back, but they did establish what is called the Old Spanish Trail that ended up coming through the extreme Four Corners regions up around Moab and down that way. And again, that was the route that finally surfaced as the one around the Grand Canyon. That was a trade route only, and that became very important. But it wasn't until the 1820s and 1830s where, again, international situation meant that there was something happening in Utah, and that is the fur industry, the fashion industry, the use of beaver pelts and furs. And it was at that time when you had a convergence in the Utah area of the Hudson's Bay Company, a British fur trapping company, down from the Oregon coast, from Washington and Oregon and Idaho into Utah. You had some of the French trappers working out of Taos, New Mexico, coming up through the southern part. In fact, one of those trappers was named Provo. So, gee, how did Provo get its name? Anton Provo. Then you had Americans working out of St. Louis. You at one time had the Russians who were working out of Alaska, because at that time they owned Alaska, coming down to the coast. So the fur industry was bringing a diversity of people even at that time. And we're all familiar with Jedediah Smith, with Jim Bridger, with Kit Carson, but this gentleman's name, James P. Beckworth, he was an African American, a mulatto, who was part of that fur company, who also was part of the whole business of fur trapping in Utah. So we very early see that there is, even at that time, beginning to be some ethnic and cultural diversity in the state of Utah. Now, what these trappers did, too, is that they were the ones that paved a lot of the trails, but using a lot of the Indian trails that had been already developed, but were able to articulate those to the settlers who were coming across the plains. And then in 1843, the U.S. government sent in a gentleman by the name of John C. Fremont to explore this Great Basin region. And Fremont brought with him an artist named Simon Carvalho, who was Spanish, but he was a Spanish Jew. And so he came in at that time. The report that John C. Fremont published in 1846 on the Great Basin found its way into the hands of Brigham Young. And so that kind of helped Brigham Young understand what was in this interior basin. And here's a slide showing the Mormon immigration into Utah in 1847. This was a little bit later because you'll see the telegraph poles. The telegraph poles were there in 1861. But even the Mormons themselves were not an ethnically unified or nationality unified group. You find a lot of them from Scotland, from England, from Denmark, from Norway, from Sweden. And so very early, and this is from a paper in Scotland, announcing the gathering of Zion, the whole idea to bring people into Utah. And so what happened very early then is that people started to come. However, there was one important feature that the LDS Church is known for in immigration history, and I have probably the expert sitting in front here, so I have to watch what I say. And that is the Perpetual Immigrating Fund and Company were established in 1849 and 1850. The Mormons were, of course, struggling in the first few years when gold was discovered at Sutter Mill, which again became an international kind of a thing. People started to move across the United States, around Cape Horn, to get up to California to discover gold, to find gold. And when those groups came through Utah, the Treasury started to develop a little bit, and so in 1849 and 1850, the Perpetual Immigrating Company and Fund were established to bring people to the state of Utah and to keep it perpetual, that when they came here, they would put back into the Treasury either in kind or in services or in some way the money, and so it was to be perpetual. That kind of went till about the 1880s when the federal government and the LDS Church really started to lock horns over the issue of polygamy. But we have the Dinwiddie brothers from England who came. We have Anna Eriksson Anderson who came from Sweden, who was actually a doctor and worked out in the western Tooele County area where the Goshute Reservation is. The Scandinavian farmers that came, again, these were Danes and Swedes and Norwegians, and they were encouraged to come together as Mormons and not as Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians. But we see a lot of the elements on the landscape that's very important. This is the Sparks Hansen House, which is in Spring City. And what you see here, according to a friend of mine who teaches at the University of Utah and worked at the Historical Society for many years, Tom Carter, who spent a year in Denmark, this house type is called a Parstuga house type. And what that means is it's a pair house. Parstuga means pair. It's a central room flanked by a pair of rooms. This building was, according to Tom, was a building style, a building type that was built by people in Denmark in the upper levels of society. Well, the Mormon immigrants that came to Utah from Denmark were not of that particular structure or stature. They weren't from the high society. But in Utah, they owned the land. They were here. And so they built a house type here that probably would not have been built in Denmark. This house is stucco and it is scored to look like brick. Scored means these lines that go across. We find in the material cultural history of Utah, especially in this early period, that the woods found here were all like pine. Pine was the predominant wood. Mormons came from different societies. They were used to building out of oak and cherry and mahogany. So what they would do is they would take pine and they would make it look like granite and make it look like mahogany and oak and other woods. And so when you look at furniture, early Mormon furniture, you begin to see that in there, and it's incredible. Same thing with the house. They began to look and try and put on embellishments that would represent the permanency of their settlement here. This lady's name is Sarah Nissonger from Santaquin, Utah, here in Utah County. These people brought with them the implements that they would need to provide for their families, to provide for themselves. And so that's why the material cultural end of this is so important to me, is that it would really get you to understand how people were using things and what they valued, and how traditions were handed down from generation to generation. Children at the school in Huntington, down in Emery County. No, I'm sorry, this is in Ephraim. This is in Ephraim. These children in that part of our history were very important for the overall economic development of the family and of the area. And so it's not uncommon to go to some of these rural areas, to the cemeteries, and when you find a child's headstone, you'll see the age of that child in days, months, and years. That's how valuable they were. That tells us that they were valued because they kept track of the days and the years and the months. This is the Christensen Otteson children in Huntington. And again, this is a George Edward Anderson photograph, and we historians are indebted to those photographers because we really get a chance to see how these photos tell us a lot about life and about what people valued. And I'll have some others that I'll kind of quiz you on here in just a moment. Well, then by the 1880s, we begin to see different a foreign language press in Utah. And again, this really kind of ties into that the international context of things. We have people from different countries, people that have different languages, albeit it's being stressed that they learn English, but what's new? That's the same thing that's happening today. With the Mormon pioneers came 3 African Americans, slave and free. Green Flake, pictured here, Oscar Crosby, and Hark Lay. Those names appear on the Brigham Young Monument, South Temple in Salt Lake City, as they do on the monument at, this is the Place State Park at the mouth of Immigration Canyon. These were African Americans, blacks, and they left a legacy, especially Green, left a legacy of families who continue to be very active in the LDS Church. The Bankhead family, the Perkins family, the James family, and others. But you see, these are granddaughters and nieces of Green Flake. So that even in that early time period, there was a history of, in this state, of African Americans. Also the cowboy, the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid kind of thing. This gentleman's name is Isom Dart. who did the same thing as Butch Cassidy did, although he repented later and became an honorable citizen. But nonetheless, you know, we don't think in terms of black cowboys in Utah. The LDS Church also very early had missionary efforts in the Sandwich Islands, the Hawaiian Islands. And in the 1880s, we see a place out in the remote western desert of Tuella County in Skull Valley called Yosepa, the word for Joseph. Hawaiian colonists were placed out in that area. Well, you can imagine coming from Honolulu and ending up there. But they were successful. They were able to pull things together the best they could. They were beset with all kinds of problems. They had a leprosy outbreak. But the Yosepa Land and Livestock Company did make a go of it. And needless to say, in 1915, when the LDS Church built the temple in Honolulu, most of them went back. I don't blame them. I would have too. But they made it. But you know what the interesting part about this, not only is it an early Hawaiian settlement, it's Hawaiian settlement. Well, today, this cemetery, and this is an older photograph of that, is the site of every Labor Day, or every Memorial Day. All of the Polynesian community, those from Samoa, from Tonga, and from Hawaii, get together and celebrate the Hawaiian, the Polynesian ethnicities out at this cemetery. They keep it very well. It's beautiful. This is a much older photograph. But so it's not just a Hawaiian symbol anymore. It's a Polynesian symbol for their connection. And it's very important. Well, with the U.S. Army coming in, with the continuing in the 1850s especially, the continuing struggle between the LDS Church and the federal government and so on and so forth, the U.S. Army came into Utah County at Camp Floyd in 1857. And two of the gentlemen that came with them were the brothers Samuel and Emmanuel Kahn, Jewish merchants who were helping to supply the U.S. Army. So again, Carvalho was a Jewish adventurer who came in the 1840s. These two gentlemen began the succession of Jewish merchants who would come into Utah, who would compete with ZCMI. And I kind of joke the fact that what happens now is that ZCMI is now Meyer and Frank. So it kind of has gone full circle. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is joined at Promontory, Utah, May 10th, 1869. The Union Pacific operating from Omaha, Nebraska, west, the Central Pacific from Sacramento, east, a lot of Irish workers with the UP side and a lot of Chinese workers from the Central Pacific side. They joined in Utah in 1869. When the U.S. soldiers had come in earlier in the 1860s, in 1862, during the Civil War, Patrick Connor, Edward Connor, was part of that. He was a prospector and a miner as well, and so he sent his troops out, and they were able to discover mineral deposits. But it wasn't until 1869 with the railroad that was really important. And here is Connor. Irish Catholic, came in, was able to establish mining as a viable way of developing the economy here, and also for Connor a way of sort of leveling the forces here by bringing in a lot of non-Mormons. But Connor really didn't get the mining going until, or the mining didn't really start until 1869 when the railroad was here. Then you began to see a dual part of the Utah economy, one agricultural and one mining. Well, the mining is the one that set things. I mean, that was an international movement. You had places very early, and I'm sorry, the black soldiers also came in with the military, the Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Thornburg, at Fort Duchesne, and the military continues to be a very important part of diversity. Well, with the mining that came then, It opened up the mineral resources in the territory of Utah. The mining areas began: silver mining, gold mining, copper mining, later coal mining. This is a mine called the Mammoth Mine down in the Tintic Mining District. This was actually originally the Mammoth Copperopolis Limited. It sold stock on the London Stock Exchange. So again, I'm just trying to weave into you the fact that mining was very important and was international. This is the Mercer area in western Tooele County. It's incredible. I mean, it developed from nothing to this in a very short period of time. The Park City area developed. And with this, not only came diverse ethnicities and miners, but also diverse religions. This is when a lot of the Protestant religions began coming into Utah to service the populations that were being developed in these particular towns. This is Silver Reef down in St. George. So you can see it's a vast network. The Chinese miner up in at the Buckhorn mine in Bingham Canyon. Chinese section gang down in Price, Utah. A Chinese gentleman who lived in Salt Lake City named Chin Sig. And a woman who came as a bride. Sesu Shi came as the bride of Wing Louie. She was a mail order bride. And there's a story that I tell that it's kind of long, but the Greeks and the Chinese were especially groups that employed the use of a pitcher bride. And you find these women, especially the one I interviewed many years ago from the Greek community, who knew no English and had her marriage arranged for her with a photograph and did not know this person, had read this letter, and this letter was written in beautiful Greek, and the guy was just a knockout, handsome guy. And she says that they made the arrangements in her village, and she came all by herself. She pinned on her lapel of her dress, Castle Gate, Utah. Okay, so she takes the steamship. She gets through Ellis Island. She takes the train. She has to be on the Pennsylvania Railroad to Chicago, and then she changes to the UP, or to the DNRG. Then she comes in and she gets off, and she doesn't know anybody. She's alone. She's got her, 2 bags, all her worldly possessions. She gets off this. She's afraid. She didn't sleep for 3 nights, afraid that she would miss the stop. She gets to Castlegate. She walks out. Nobody's there except there's this old rugged-looking guy in this wagon, and he summons her to come. And she goes alone with this guy that she doesn't know, takes her to this remote camp in Carbon County. Well, they don't see many women in these camps, so she gets there, and there's thousands of guys. And, oh no! Funny, all of a sudden, this funny-looking guy, as she told me, ugly, comes up to her, and she looks at the photograph, and it's not him, but guess what? It's him. He sent somebody else's photograph and had someone else write her the letter. As she told me, love came later, and that's the case. Real quickly, because I'm running out of time, what's the problem with this photograph, besides being a little bit out of focus? He's too large. Yeah, he's huge. I'll tell you why. This is Chin Quan Chan, who lived in Salt Lake. Many immigrant groups value family is the cornerstone. I mean, it's the cornerstone for everything, okay? And in many cultures, when you can't be with your family physically, you want to be with them spiritually and psychologically. So Chin Quan Chan had his photo superimposed on the photo of his family in China so that they could have a family picture, that he could be with them. And that's the case of a lot of groups. And there's other stories there, but again, I'm running out of time. Well, coupled with that mining activity, the coal mining came to Utah in the late 1880s and 1890s and really opened up a whole new vista. Castlegate, Carbon County, you had Cornish people from Cornwall that came to work in those mines. You had Italians, you had Greeks, you had Serbians, Slovenians, Croatians, Finns, And then in the 19-teens, Mexican workers coming in. So it really changed the face of Utah in terms of the population. And with it, the economic development, because again, investment was happening in Utah mines all over the world. Castlegate would develop into this incredible town. You would see brickwork done by Chinese and Greek and Italian miners on the mines. Usually those from England would be the ones who of course, would become the bosses. And in May 1st, 1900, you had the fourth worst mining accident in U.S. history happen in winter quarters. 200 miners were killed in a mine explosion. Many of them were Finnish. This is the Luoma family, a Finnish family in Schofield. 9 male members of that family, most of the male members in this, that are in that picture, died in that explosion. Schofield Cemetery still resonates with a feeling that haunts people in that area of that mine explosion. And we had the 100-year commemoration on May 1st, 2000. We drew about 3,000 people to that service. Many of them came from Finland and from other countries, international. So again, I tell you, the international connection is there. The Finnish sauna that belonged to a gentleman named Niilomäki. Again, elements on the landscape to help us understand tradition. The Italian family, the Picetto family, the halfway house, halfway between Castlegate and Price. This is another one of my favorite photographs. This is Frank Mangoni and his wife Teresa in about 1914. The title down here, Papa's First Payday. Obviously, he's giving his money to Teresa. This photograph, according to the children, was taken so that they could send that photo back to Teresa's mother in Italy and let her know that her daughter was okay. She was being taken care of. And the culprits to all of this were these 3 kids. Taken in a boxcar. Leah, who was the daughter that gave us the photographs, said it was taken in the morning. And I said, how do you know? And she said, because we were clean. And so, but look at the flags, the Italian flag and the American flag. This is what was happening with those second generation and third generation of folks. They were starting to come together. So when you look on the landscape, you see the Italian Christopher Columbus Society, or the Società Cristoforo Colombo, who had a float entry in the July 24th parade. July 24th had no significance for Italians, but according to one of the people who was involved in that float, that organization wanted to celebrate their pioneer, Christopher Columbus, on a day designated by the local community as Pioneer Day. So that, again, shows how the accommodation process was coming about. Greeks dressed in the Faustinella of mainland Greece and the Phrakes of Crete coming to this country. These people didn't get along even though they were Greek. One group was freed from Turkish rule quite a bit earlier than this group. They felt betrayed. These old world antagonisms find themselves in Utah. Still do to a certain extent. But nonetheless, they came together, and the Greek Orthodox Church, as the Greek Orthodox Church, is a big factor in why I think the Greek community has been perhaps the most successful in maintaining their culture and traditions and manifesting those to the larger community through the Greek festivals that they have, one in Ogden, one in Salt Lake, and one in Price, because the Greek Orthodox Church is the Greek Orthodox Church. Well, okay, these folks were coming together. They were actively involved. This is the Hiawatha Pool Hall. This is a guy named Joe Howa. Have you heard of Howa Construction? Well, that's how Howa Construction started. The Lowenstein Mercantile. Samuel Newhouse, another Jew, Jewish mining entrepreneur who did a lot for the landscape in Salt Lake City. The Slovenian home in Carbon County that's still there, that was a place where Slovenians could get together and fill at home. Japanese were also very much involved, and some of the early Japanese that were recorded in the mining towns of Bingham Canyon were not Japanese at all. They were Koreans. They were Koreans. This is the Taniguchi wedding in Carbon County, and you talk about extended family. That's extended family. Basque sheep herders, French Basques, Spanish Basques coming in, joining forces with Mormon sheep herders in San Pete County, or with Greek sheep herders. And here you have two from Carbon County, Ducier and Malaris, who were one French Basque and one Greek sheep herder. Sheep herding became an important way for Basques to make a living. People from other Eastern European countries, these were just labeled gypsies. This is a photograph that was taken in Salt Lake City in 1910. This is Edward Daiguro Hashimoto, who was a labor agent for the Japanese and for the Mexicans. Mexican workers on the railroad in 1910, especially after the Revolution. Migrant workers continue to be very important. Mexican children on the west side of Salt Lake City, and Mexicans who became part of the Lucero Ward, the LDS Ward, also in Salt Lake City. So again, people coming here for different motives, religious motives, economic motives, but finding a living in Utah. This, on the landscape, again, you can begin to see the diversity. This is a Mexican baking oven, a Greek baking oven, and an Italian baking oven. So you really get to see that there is on the landscape some diversity. In the 1920s, there was immigration legislation passed which discriminated against Southern and Eastern European. It was tied to a quota system. That, coupled with the Depression, really slowed down and stopped immigration basically into this country. And we pick up at World War I or World War II. This is the Topaz Relocation Center in Delta, where Japanese internees from the West Coast were kept. There were a series of these camps, and Utah had its own. After the war, Mormon missionary activity picked up. This is the Swiss Chorus Edelweiss. Germans who had come in earlier, the European scene was so bad that then people began coming as refugees, and then families could sponsor others. In the 70s, you had the Vietnam War that caused the same thing. So you begin to see Cambodians, Laotians, and Hmong people. This is a group of South Vietnamese in the West Valley City area in Salt Lake. Hmong girls with the story cloth that became very important to tell a story of their. Mostly, it wasn't something that was old and traditional in their culture. It really developed in that time period when they were fleeing the ravages of war. But very early, these people would go from this kind of dress to this kind of dress. Again, to show you that this is at West High School. Again, a group of Hmong. Then, of course, the Polynesians began to come again in the 80s. Very significant because of the missionary activity. Tongans and Samoans. This is a Tongan wedding in Salt Lake. This is the Liabana High School reunion from Tonga. There were so many of them that they could hold their reunion in Salt Lake City. And that's what they did. And so as we look at Utah history now, even now, we're getting people from Bosnia, from Croatia, from the Middle East, from just a number of Eastern European countries. And as we go down the streets, it's really hard to distinguish that Utah is just this homogeneous group of people. So with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Sorry I had to hurry so fast, but I want to make sure that you get back to class. Any questions? Yes?
My question was that you talked about the Perpetual Immigration Fund, which, the Mormon leaders were like, we want more Mormons to come
Well, they wanted to stress, in fact, one of the reasons that immigrants from other countries began to come here in the mining period is because Brigham Young did not want Mormons to be involved in mining of the precious metals. That didn't mean iron mining and coal mining, but because of the moral decay that he sensed that the towns brought with them. But for the most part, and even when you look at the immigration quota acts that I mentioned in the 20s, a lot of our senators and representatives were voting against that because they did see that Southern and Eastern Europeans and Asians were different. But that wasn't strictly just a Utah phenomenon. That happened nationwide. So obviously, where the missionary activities were mostly was where the church believed that most of the people who were of the blood of Israel were from, and so that's why they stress those. But there's very early indications that even among some of the other groups that there was a cooperation, but at the same time there was still that tense feeling. But the early people that were part of the immigration for the Perpetual Immigrating Fund and Company were from the countries where the Mormon missionary activity was most entrenched. Is that right, Richard? Richard Jensen has the authority on that. Written some great articles about it. Very important. In fact, when I went to Minnesota to study, and Minnesota has an immigration school there that's really important, that was one of the things that they really talked about, was how this was very unique. So for the LDS Church to have this kind of an institution was really quite important. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Wasn't there a Jewish community?
Yes.
Except for Utah somewhere.
Clarion in San Pete County. It was established around 1914, was part of what an international, back to the soil movement. And a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Brown, who later became the founder of the Intermountain Farmers Association, brought a group of Jews to Clarion. It's down by Gunnison. And they tried to make a go of it. The Mormons actually, worked with them very, but of course, the vagaries of the weather and everything, it failed. They tried again, it failed, and then they left. And some of them who were very important to that financially were people like the Arbacks, who had the Arback store in Salt Lake, and Simon Bamberger, who later became the governor of the state of Utah in 1916. So yes, there was. There was. Yes, sir.
When did the mining population grow? Over what time period? When did it peak and decline? And did the people stay in Utah, or did they move to the coast?
Boy, you're covering a whole range of areas. It really began in the 1870s. Okay, that's when commercial mining really started, and the people that really started to come in from European countries and from Asian countries started around the 1880s and 1890s, and I would say that it peaked in about the 20s, and then because of the immigration restriction, started to go down. Now, the second part of your question is really important, because these groups were a very fluid group. At first, they wanted just to come here, make money, and then go back to their homeland. They didn't want to stay here. But once they got here and the opportunities were available to them, that's when they decided, around 1910, and I mean, some earlier, some later, that's when they decided to start to send for wives and establish families. But because they were a fluid labor force, a lot of them moved around. And so, for example, I found that one of the patterns for Utah was that these groups would come up and they'd go to the Northern Iron Range of Michigan, Minnesota, and over to Red Lodge, Montana, and then down into the mines in Wyoming, in Superior, Wyoming, then down in the mines in Utah, and then down into southern Colorado. So there were those kinds of patterns. And the reason that we know they're patterns is because we've had geographers study the dispersion of foreign language newspapers from these different ethnic groups, and you can see those patterns kind of develop. So yeah, so they were a fluid group, and a lot of them didn't stay, and that's why you never see the big ethnic enclaves in Utah, because I mean, we only have 2 million people for the whole state, and for some of the cities in the east, I mean, that's a population in itself. So we don't have the big population of these groups or the big concentration because we don't have that many overall. But because it was a very important part of the flow of immigration, that's why I think it's even far more significant than we think. Yes, sir.
In light of that last response there, are there any noticeably Italian communities still, maybe in the Carbon County?
Well, you go to Helper and open the phone book, and you'll see a lot of Italian names. Yes, yeah, yes.
Is there, I'm doing a paper on for Utah actually, and I was just wondering, is the ethnic diversity that existed when the coal mines were first opened up, is there still that many different ethnic diversities?
Yes.
Wow, that's cool.
Yes, yes. In fact, you should probably go to the Helper Mining Museum. Have you been there? Ask for Madge Tomsick. She's the brains down there. And tell her I sent you. Yes.
What were the 5 cities in Colombia that fed into Utah?
Okay, the ones that are you Italian? Okay, the ones I visited were these: Aiello Calabro, Grimaldi, Decolatura, Pedivigliano, which is where my family's from, and Colosimi. And now, when I married my wife, and I brought her to Utah, of course she had undergone some culture shock coming to Utah. But when she came here, her godmother, the woman that was her baptismal sponsor in Italy, was living here. Her cousins, she had cousins living here. There were more Italians from her area here than in Trenton, New Jersey. And Trenton has a massive amount of Italians. So, I mean, really, it just puts everything in just a whole different perspective. The story I told you about the woman that had the point of reference, I mean, I've heard that. In fact, Dean May, bless his heart, who passed away last year, was a good friend of mine. He had spent some time in Germany and other areas and had come across the same thing, that people could relate to Utah because of a cousin or an uncle or something else. So it really is an international kind of thing, and I'm convinced more than ever that those people have had me back to do presentations off and on because they sense that, again, that part of their history is ours and part of ours is theirs, and they want to know about it. And I think that's why the successful reaction that we had to the Olympic Games. So what's happening in this center for me is really important. So, one last question.
You mentioned a lot of the Indian trails that are now becoming highways. Is that pretty true nationwide?
I think so. I think so. Because it stands to reason, and especially when you go out in the field, and I was really fortunate in my graduate career to work with David Miller at the University of Utah, who was a historian that wanted to go out into the field. And when you see the terrain, I mean, obviously this is going to be the best route between these areas, and those are the routes that that people have followed for eons of time. So yeah.
Like would the Oregon Trail, is that like a based on Indian trails or?
Probably. Probably, yeah. I mean, they're just trails that that a lot of people use to get from one place to the next. And they follow the water, sure. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.